Good evening, everyone, and thank you for the opportunity to be here and to present to you all. I'm going to be doing a brief overview of the cybersecurity program that the Coast Guard has brought online in the last few years. Next slide, please. So these are some overarching guidance documents that have been released from the Coast Guard in the last 2 or 3 years. The Cybersecurity Strategic Outlook was released, which in 2021, which outlines the Coast Guard's need to work with industry and work with our partners across the port to ensure that our cybersecurity practices are being reviewed and strengthened through various means. And the Strategic Outlook is sort of like the 50,000 foot level document that outlines that. And this presentation, by the way, is available to anybody who wants to review it. All of the hyperlinks are active, so you can, if you're interested, you can drill into it a little bit further. And then this last February, we had an executive order that was released from the White House outlining additional practices, essentially, that enables the captain of the port across the Coast Guard to ensure that there is safety and security in the port, and that if there is any incident that is impacting that captain of the port zone, the captain of the port is then empowered to respond and to mitigate that risk. Next slide, please. So cybersecurity in Alaska is a unique challenge in the maritime domain. There are several reasons for this. This image here that you're looking at shows you the inland ports, and this is a GIS map that was created. So you have the state of Alaska broken down into captain of port zones. You have Southeast Alaska there to the right, and then Prince William Sound in the middle there, and then Western Alaska and the Arctic sector AOR's area of responsibility to the left side of that screen there. And the thing that I wanted to point out was that we are very dependent on supply chain distribution in Alaska, more so, you could argue, than pretty much anywhere else in the United States. And the inland terminals or inland ports are outlined right there with a blue dot. This shows you sort of the magnitude of distribution throughout the state in terms of what is coming in through the coastal ports and then what gets distributed further inland. Next slide, please. So this is a very simplistic infographic, essentially, that shows a typical marine transportation system port. So you have your multimodal connection points, you have commerce going in and out, and it's usually in proximity to a major city. You have several critical infrastructure sectors represented here, and you have, energy, transportation, maritime. So this is just meant to illustrate, what the major ports of Alaska all have in common. Next slide, please. So when we're talking about cybersecurity, and we're talking about it in the marine transportation system, we are more specifically trying to drill into the topics of information technology and operational technology. So there are two larger camps of data technology going on. And I put this schematic up here on the right-hand side and highlighted some of the things that may sound familiar to you all within your own organization. In terms of information technology, we have our typical HR, human capital systems that are running in the background. We also have the day-to-day programming that we use, whether it be, Microsoft systems or Adobe. That's all, those are all software programs that are considered information technology. Operational technology, by contrast, has to do with the physical manipulation of things or resources or assets on your terminal or on your vessel. So the example that I frequently will use is, the keypad that opens the gate to that facility, that would be a good example of an operational technology. It can be made even more complex if those physical things can be manipulated from a panel that is not geographically co-located. So it could be like a command center that's located in Anchorage, for example. And when we're talking about cybersecurity, we're really looking for the vulnerabilities that exist in the overlap between the IT and the OT systems. So we're very interested in seeing if there is any opportunity for a bad actor or for something to penetrate the IT architecture and potentially manipulate something in the physical realm. That's really what keeps us up at night. So next slide, please. So some potential maritime operational attacks that exist. There's the disruption and delay when it comes to tying up at a terminal or receiving cargo, offloading cargo, anything that has to do with their daily operational schedule. There's also navigation disruptions, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that in the next slide. There's operational technology such as remote hijacking of vessels or shoreside equipment, and then blockages, cyber-related disabling of bridges or locks that would then delay commerce. Next slide, please. So when we're talking about the navigation of vessels coming in and out of port, there is something called spoofing that exists where the coordinates that are assigned to that vessel can be actually falsely articulated as being, so the vessel will appear to be in a different location than it actually is. And that is something that is talked about a lot in the maritime industry in terms of being a risk for obvious reasons. If you had a vessel that was transiting in, let's say it's, foul weather conditions, and the signature of where that vessel is showing up on its AIS system shows that it is further offshore than it really is, that could be potentially, a high risk situation, especially if there are tugs assigned or, some other scenario involved. So that is a potential risk as well through the AIS system. Next slide. So at this point, I just wanted to kind of articulate where the Coast Guard cybersecurity fits into the greater infrastructure discussion. So when we're talking about critical infrastructure, there are 16 critical infrastructure sectors as outlined by the National Infrastructure Protection Plan. And DHS is actually the sector-specific agency for 11 of those 16 sectors. Additionally, you'll see them outlined here on the slide. Additionally, there are 4 lifeline sectors that are considered critical. So what I mean by that is I usually use the stool analogy. So if you have 4 legs to the stool, being communications, energy, transportation, and water, wastewater. And you can apply this to any facility, any vessel, any community. If you kick out one of those lifeline sectors, the other 3 will very quickly be impacted to a severe degree. And in addition to this, if you don't have functionality in these 4, the community or the entity, the asset, will be critically impacted very, very quickly, more so than the other sectors listed here. So when we're talking about cybersecurity and we're talking about where we want to focus our priority and where we want to focus all of our energy, we're really looking at these 4 lifeline sectors. So the Coast Guard, with the maritime domain, we are maintaining that cybersecurity connectivity with our port partners, but we make up one node essentially within that transportation sector. So we are in constant communication in this ecosystem of cybersecurity with other folks, other modes of transportation, other folks in the energy sector, the communication sector, and the water wastewater sectors. They all kind of intersect at that water line. So that is a large part of my job, is to work with all of the industry partners. Next slide, please. So this slide here, I know it's kind of a strange color aspect, but this is articulating where the undersea cables are that go around Alaska. And I'm not sure how many folks on this in this meeting have remembered the cable that got severed about a year and a half ago, which knocked out connectivity in Valdez. I'm sure in other parts of the state as well. But when you're talking about something as simple as going down to the store and using your debit card to pay for something, or going home and streaming your favorite show on one of our streaming apps that are available usually, we were not able to do that. Valdez was impacted for several days by one of these cables being severed. And this is a really good way of illustrating how something can happen hundreds of miles away, but in the world of cybersecurity, we're not geographically bound to the origin of where that incident occurs. And that's something that's really important that we ask people to consider. So in this case, a cable was severed several hundred miles away and it impacted us in Valdez. So next slide, please. So here are some case studies that I wanted to just sort of include into this slideshow. The Maersk line was disrupted in 2017. It cost hundreds of millions of dollars to the company. And I'm not going to go through every single one here, but I do encourage, if you're interested in seeing the economic impact that does happen to industry as a result of a cybersecurity incident, by all means, you could read on any one of these things and you'll see that these are not small incidents and the impacts are not small. They are felt worldwide and they are hundreds of millions of dollars. There is a current risk that exists right now called Volt Typhoon, and I wanted to also bring that out into tonight's discussion because it is something that was observed more than a year ago now, and it is a known and confirmed threat to cyber infrastructure across the country. But it originates from China, but they are specifically focused on getting into critical infrastructure hubs. So power stations, dams, locks, airports. And what they have done successfully is they have been able to infiltrate into the IT architecture and then they stay very, very quiet. They have not pushed the proverbial red button. They are still sitting there and waiting for the time that they deem appropriate to act. It is something that the government knows about. It is a very real, persistent threat, and it's a good articulation of how cybersecurity or how cyber attacks can work. Basically, you have to imagine somebody sneaking into your house and basically hiding behind the curtain until they have the information they need. In this particular case of Volt Typhoon, they are using something called living off the land, which means that they don't necessarily leave a breadcrumb trail either. They learn the methods and the daily operational habits of the organization, and they learn to mimic that. So it becomes very hard to detect when they're looking through files, essentially. So not to sound like overly scary to everybody here, but Volt Typhoon is something that we are very interested in and keeping our eye on. So next slide, please. So in terms of Alaska and incidents that have impacted us here in the state, we had an incident shortly after I started my time here in this position in April of 23, where there was a cyber attack that impacted Americold Storage, which is based out of Oregon. And the response that the corporation took at that time was to send out a public statement saying that they were not going to receive any new product into their food distribution warehouses for a period of 5 or 6 days. And normally, if you're in the lower 48, that wouldn't necessarily be, a dramatic impact. But Americold provides cold food storage to about 20% of the country, and most notably to all of the warehouses in Tacoma that ship groceries to Alaska. So when we heard that there was going to be a delay of, anywhere between 4 and 6 days of incoming food, that is something that is very alarming, especially to remote communities. Here in Valdez, for example, we know that we only have a few days of groceries on the shelves at any given time. So this is a really good example of how something, again, can happen remotely elsewhere, but it can impact us in a very dramatic way here in Valdez. And then I also mentioned the cable incident already. The third example that I wanted to bring up that happened this year was a shipping company that had a ransomware attack. The company was home ported out of Beaverton, Oregon, and the first ship in the fleet that observed an impact was actually located in Delaware Bay. But we had a ship that was actually steaming into Prince William Sound at the same time that was also impacted. And the response that we went through was to essentially go through a lot of risk mitigation and a lot of Q&A, trying to figure out the scope of the threat and whether or not it was contained, or whether or not the vessel could still navigate, and if its systems were impacted, its navigation or operational systems were impacted, and they were not. So in this particular case, we were very lucky because we didn't have the risk to the operational technology systems that I spoke of earlier. So in that particular case, the ransomware that was on with this company was unsuccessful. They did not achieve their goal of getting money in exchange for data because we were able to contain the incident, and it was pretty successful in terms of that. Some lessons learned that came from this incident have to do with strengthening our understanding of sharing that information across critical infrastructure sectors, like I said before, and also making sure that we're tying in the entire fleet of a company. So getting around that idea that just because something is in your backyard, you're the only one impacted, because that's not the case. And we ended up working across the country in several captain report zones on this incident. So next slide, please. Okay, so what do? This may look very similar to the ICS gurus in the room, and I'm not saying industrial control systems, I'm saying incident command systems. This is a diagram of the NIST 2.0 framework, and NIST is very similar to ICS. It's a standardized model or methodology that's being applied across the country. So private corporations, as well as multiple jurisdictions at the federal, state, local, tribal, and territorial, are all kind of going towards this standardized approach. So we work to identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. And there is a 2.0 version of this framework that has been released. It is publicly available if you wanted to go online and look into this more specifically. There's a lot of great information about the NIST 2.0 rollout. Next slide, please. And within the Coast Guard, we have cyber protection teams. So the cyber incident that I just spoke of with a shipping company, they did everything right. They basically called the NRC to report the incident. And then they were told that if they requested the CPT to come out, our CPTs can actually do forensics on the IT architecture, and they can identify where the malware is located, what files may have been compromised. They basically do an entire analysis. So CPTs are available upon request. We have 3 teams, so we are growing this capability. But in addition to our CPTs, the FBI does this as well. So does CISA. CISA is the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. they also have the ability of deploying folks to do this kind of assessment. So if there is an impact to any of your organizations, if you want to know more about what they can do, feel free to reach out to me, and you can also reach out to the CBT teams directly. There's a email address right there at the bottom of the slide, but they are by request only. So if there's something that you need additional support on, feel free to reach out. And next slide, please. These are just some general cyber marine transportation system references in case anybody is interested. And next slide. And that's it for me. Are there any questions? Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks, Kristina. Are there any questions in the room here?
Kristina, thank you for that. That's an eye-opener. And being an ex-chief engineer, I shudder to think that what they could do to a ship, especially an automated ship. And I'm just wondering, when they have had disruption, it's operational, and you probably can't talk anymore about what actually it affected, but it certainly is interesting to me to know what they go after. Is it navigational or operational?
Yeah, that's a very good question. In this particular case, they were really just focused on the administrative side of the company, which was, I mean, it was lucky, to be honest. They were going after their maintenance records and their personally identifiable information on some of their employees. So I will say that there's an element of the cyber world that hits differently than a normal pre-cyber impact to an organization. And that is that they have the ability to know what your address is, what your checking account is. Like, I don't want to be like overly sensationalistic about this, but the thing that really makes cyber scarier to a lot of people, and rightfully so, is that the data that they're looking for is very, very granular and particular to every employee. So, you know, even something like the email traffic within an organization that may be considered valuable if, you know, company A is trying to compete for contract against company B, and there's dialogue going on in there. Even something like that could have a dollar value associated with it for ransomware if somebody wanted to be nefarious. So, so I think that element of it is what a lot of ransomware goes for. They're looking for something that's a little bit more sensationalistic that way. But in terms of like actually being able to hack into a system and manipulate something physically, you know, obviously that comes with a whole separate set of risk that is also not good and scary. So I can say that it seems that people are taking it more seriously as time goes on, and also people are not paying out ransomware as much as they used to. 2 years ago, ransomware was really taking off because it was being paid, and the thought process back then was, let's just pay so that we can have what appears to be our data back safe and secure. I would argue that, you know, once it's out there, it's out there. So the idea that you're getting your data back and returned to you and that it's not being saved somewhere else is, I don't know. I wouldn't say that, but that has stopped. So ransomware payments are decreasing, thankfully. And that is helping to kind of like pull back on the ransomware attack numbers. But there are more sophisticated IT systems being implemented. The number one thing I can say is cyber hygiene is paramount. So I know everybody here probably hears it all the time, but don't make your password. Don't make your password 01. Like, put the effort into having a really good password, even use multi-factor authentication if you can. Those two simple things will go a tremendous ways in terms of, mitigating that risk. So.
Any questions online?
Mike Donnellan from ADEC asked, how connected are tankers, cargo ships, and other large vessels? Is there a central computer that could remotely control critical ship systems, parentheses, nav, engine, steering, etc.? If so, is there a cutoff or full manual override?
So it varies from company to company, and every company every company has its own way of operating, right? So some companies are like Maersk are very advanced. Cruise ship industry super advanced with their technology. They have a lot of redundancies. They have a lot of safeguards put into the way they operate. They do have override capabilities. They also have more remote server rooms, which allows them to be able to access that data from multiple places. If one is compromised, they can still run. They have redundancy. However, you do have companies that are, maybe a little bit smaller that are using more out-of-the-box technology solutions. And whenever you have something that's out of the box without a dedicated service contract alongside it, like you just buy the software, but you're not paying for the updates and the patches from that vendor that are being pushed to you as a customer, you run that risk of basically creating a vulnerability, because then it becomes incumbent on your IT staff, basically, or whoever's managing your architecture, to make sure that they're staying up to speed with every software update and patch that is available. That's a very big burden for anyone. So I typically recommend that when you're going to, if you're in a position of having to choose a software package for your organization, to try to make sure that there's an element of support, customer service support, that you can tap into to make sure that you're getting the most current information and you're getting all those updates that you really need to have. Does that answer your question?
Thank you, Kristina.